Well, there has been a lot of reaction over the past week to the comments made by Manitoba's Minister of Accessibility about an American Sign Language interpreter. First reported by APTN News, Nahanni Fontaine was caught on camera saying the interpreter was distracting and should not have been on stage. And as you just heard, one of the deaf graduates in the audience at the event says Fontaine had the interpreter removed from the stage. For more on the fallout, our Truth in Politics panel is here. Jennifer Laewetz is the CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Jennifer, Niigaan, great to see you both. Niigaan, let's start with you and your thoughts on what Accessibility Minister Nahanni Fontaine had to say about the ASL interpreter when she was unaware she was on camera.
Well, it's a good lesson that the mics are always hot, and if you don't want things to be said in public, you shouldn't say them in front of cameras. Whether you're unaware or not, you should know better than this. This was also a big mistake, and I think she's acknowledged that. She's apologized. I'm not sure what this pound of flesh that people want. If she's going to resign, then the reality is that if you are a politician and you say atrociously offensive things, you could be U.S. president, but I guess you can't be Minister of Accessibility. Nahanni Fontaine, I marched with her. I've worked with her for years. She's a person who, yes, a complicated person. Yes, a person that sometimes makes mistakes. I mean, who doesn't? I certainly have over the years. And but is a person who has owned it and has done much good work over the years. And I know for sure that she is someone who is a very strong advocate for people who need accessibility needs. I think, if anything, she should work on building relationships with communities and leave it at that.
Jennifer, there has been a lot of reaction to this. Many are defending the minister for making a mistake, and she has issued 2 apologies now. What's your take on it?
Well, it's kind of tough because I am, an Indigenous person that lives with a permanent disability. So I have a lot of personal feelings in the matter on how people view people with disabilities, and especially Indigenous people with disabilities. And that's why we have organizations like BC and that are out there to make sure that we're represented. I think when it comes to this specific minister, I think she's great. I'm actually a big fan of her, and I don't want to see her out of cabinet. And I also am really hesitant to say that she should resign from her position as minister. I think we need to leave it up to these disability organizations to meet with her and then to make that decision on what they see is the right outcome from this. It is ministers that are responsible for files like that essentially have mandates to break down barriers, and also so that people understand what those barriers are. So when we're hearing people say these things behind closed doors, it kind of also tells us that there may not be an understanding of how important it is to bring accessibility into every space that we're in. So whether or not she should remain as the minister of that department is obviously up for the debate. But I don't think that we should make this super political either. I think that moments like this can be used as teaching moments on why we have these ministries, why we have accessibility resources in these spaces, and what we can all learn from this.
Well, to the surprise of nobody, I think, Niigaan, the progressive conservatives here in Manitoba have called for her resignation. Your podcast colleague, Dan Laewetz, has written an editorial out on this, pondering whether Premier Paskwâw should fire Minister Fontaine over this. I take it from what you said earlier, though, that you don't think it needs to go that far.
Well, no surprise. I mean, the opposition's got to talk about, pulling down the government or pulling down elements of the government. There's a very popular provincial government in Manitoba. Paskwâw's popularity ratings are very high. The Conservatives cannot reach those heights other than to try to attack him at any angle that they can get. And this is certainly an angle that they can attack. Nahanni Fontaine has been affiliated with Paskwâw, thinking all the way back to his moments within his leadership run, in which he was accused of different things. It was Nahanni Fontaine who was there during every press conference, standing beside, supporting Paskwâw. In many ways, Nahanni Fontaine's career is really wrapped up in Paskwâw's success too. So I'm not surprised at all that the opposition would be going after that. I'm not surprised that pundits like my colleague Dan Laewetz would ponder openly, because it's worth talking about. It's worth talking, as Janet pointed out, that it's worth the potential discussion of whether the Minister of Accessibility portfolio is appropriate for someone who perhaps said these offensive things. That doesn't mean that she should leave cabinet, doesn't mean certainly that she should leave the NDP caucus. What it means is that perhaps stepping aside, or maybe being overwhelmed, or being somebody who needs to step aside and learn a little bit. And I mean, we all need to do those things. This is nothing to be shameful of. And I don't think that having a public trial or having, calling someone out publicly and questioning their entire career over one mistake is a worthwhile endeavor. It's certainly not productive, and it's certainly not Indigenous to do that.
As Dan points out, the House is obviously on summer break here, or the legislature, so we're not hearing about it there. Do you think, though, Minister Fontaine also has the gender equality and families? Those are some big portfolios to have here in the province. Jennifer, do you think there needs to be a new Minister of Accessibility in Manitoba?
When this first happened, I was calling for her resignation because I was upset. I think I actually just said she needs to be removed from that position. And I think it's because the PWD, which is the people with disabilities community, is so tight knit, especially on, X and TikTok and LinkedIn. It's almost like my same people that I go to see what their takes are also on this. But disabilities are also very diverse. And I think that is why people that are placed in these positions, especially to be ministers responsible for these portfolios, have to have such a good understanding of what disabilities are and what they look like, and how the accessibility piece is huge. Because really, it's not about giving people those extra resources or making people uncomfortable on stage because the interpreter is there. I think people need to recognize that people with disabilities have significant barriers in a lot of areas of our lives. For me, I'm visually impaired, and I also live with a permanent neuro disease. So some of my disabilities sometimes aren't always seen, but some of the resources or accessibility measures that I need are life-changing for me, and they can make or break my situation in a room. And I just think about how somebody there might have been hard of hearing, and that would have been their resource to enjoy that event. So I just think there's a lot of learning that can happen here. And I think that maybe this is a little bit of a hot take. I think this is why everybody needs to have some level of training, or even awareness training on what disabilities looks like, especially while we're going to be passing disability legislation and disability acts and making our society more inclusive and accessible. Then we need to make sure that we're watching what we say, because it's behind closed doors what's being said that concerns me about the knowledge around disabilities.
Niigaan, final thoughts on this all? How do you see this moving forward for the minister?
Well, the thing that's been most interesting to me about this is you don't see a sort of typical constituency that in the past Minister Fontaine has advocated for. It actually has been a lot of women, probably led by women and young people, to constituencies that she has in the past been very supportive of. Who have been perhaps the most vociferous and loud and boisterous in their calls for accountability on this matter. That tells me that there's something going on that perhaps in the past, perhaps this is not really about this issue. Maybe it was that in the past, Minister Fontaine has done something at a public gathering with certain individuals in which they've taken this opportunity to really sort of get one back, as we both know that, or we all know that Minister Fontaine is very loud and is not afraid to call people out publicly at certain other public events in the past. I certainly have been at the brunt of some criticism from her publicly in the past, and so I certainly know how that feels. And I guess I would say to those individuals that two wrongs don't really make a right here. I think that what we want to do is we want to help people who are learning all the things that Jen spoke about earlier. And I think certainly at this point we want to listen to people from the disability community, that they should be taking some leadership on this and helping Minister Fontaine and anyone else who makes mistakes in this regard. And like I said before, none of us are perfect. All of us make mistakes. And certainly if we're going to define somebody by one mistake for their entire career, we're going to result in a lot of bodies by the side of the road. And let's not also forget, you can be president of the United States and make fun of people who are disenfranchised, disabled, and nothing happens to you. So if that's the case, somebody in this scenario, I mean, why is it that we're demanding a pound of flesh in this scenario?
Well, moving on then, slightly related, I guess, to that same individual in the U.S., it was Canada Day this week, and I read that people were more patriotic this year. Was that the case, Jennifer?
It's hard to say. I live in a city that is over half of our population is Indigenous. So historically speaking, Canada Day is kind of one of those weird things. But also, like my husband had to go to one of the Canada Day events, and it's one of those things where like you see fellow Indigenous people there, and you kind of just side eye, like, well, the food trucks are here and the fireworks are here, and it's like there's this really, I had posted on social media about how there is a long history of what Canada is and how Canada came to be. And there are hurtful conversations happening online right now about like land back and people saying the land was not stolen. And there's some hard conversations that I don't even want to get into around Canada Day. But then there's that piece too where I'm like, this is a great country to live in. And, I really appreciate my neighbors and I appreciate my community I live in. And these are areas that I have a lot of love for. So it's kind of tough because Canada Day is one of those things where you're like, do we participate? Do we not participate? Like where, and there were even protests on the highway where I live. So people are trying to shut down the highway for Canada Day. And yeah, it's tough. But I will say that I did see a lot of fellow Indigenous people out at the Canada Day celebrations, but I noticed like there wasn't a lot of like clapping for certain things. And also a lot of ribbon skirts. I saw a lot of ribbon skirts this year. So I see the two worlds almost meshing, but we still have to coexist in this world, and it's a little bit weird.
Niigaan, did you notice a fresh wave of patriotism?
Well, Canada Day for me was, I was the Indigenous speaker at the new citizenship ceremonies by Immigration Canada, where they show a 5-minute video. They also have a person from the traditional territory in which newcomers are becoming Canadians are speaking, and I happened to be the individual from Treaty 1 that was speaking. It was an emotional event. I'm not going to lie. It was an event in which we heard stories of people who came from horrendous situations overseas, situations in which they were facing utter brutality, misogyny, sexism, genocide, and in many cases, they are finding a new life in this place, and they're very thankful. And one of the things that I experienced was newcomers who were so profoundly moved by meeting an Indigenous person, and particularly hearing about the story that they are also treaty people now that they are part of these relationships. It's hard not to be moved by that. It's also hard not to be inspired by some of the movements and challenges the United States is posing on all of us. I think all of us realize that our treaties were made for a reason, that we're all married, working with, living beside one another. And working with one another. But at the same time, we have a very complicated path in front of us. The bill that's about to be posing in Ontario and British Columbia, also the national bill, the One Great Canadian Economy or One Canadian Economy Act, will pose major challenges and conflicts going forward. So we may be seeing a moment of patriotism, of inclusivity, of people celebrating not just Canada, but also treaty. But I think that conflicts are going to be coming this summer.
Before we go, last week we spoke about the infighting over at the Métis Nation, Saskatchewan. Jennifer, can you bring us up to speed on where things stand today?
I don't think there's been a lot of updates since the press conference from the two barred elected officials from the table. I think right now in the last week, I've uncovered a rabbit hole that I don't think I've wanted to uncover, but it also raises the question about self-government, and not just for First Nations, but also Métis citizens as well, that, self-government is a very, very big responsibility and it has to be done right. It's also a learning curve, and inevitably people are going to be learning. But I think right now in front of us, we are watching whether or not we're able to essentially handle our own democracy, our own government, our own people. And all eyes right now in Saskatchewan feel like they're on the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan and the moves that are going to come next, whether these two elected officials will be restored to their positions or whether they will continue to be shut out until some of the things that it seems that the provincial table wants from them in order for them to be restored.
Well, we'll be watching that one as well. Jennifer, Niigaan, thanks to you both.
I'm glad. Thanks.